ends. More compromise from His Majesty's government as new trans guidance for schools is set to fall short of an all-out ban on pupil transitioning for fear of potentially violating the Equality Act. Instead, staff will be spared the obligation to have any duty to let children alter their gender identity. Will this make a difference at all? Naval hero Lord Nelson has in recent years been accused of being a white supremacist and a racist supporter of slavery, with some calling for his statue in Trafalgar Square to be toppled. But it's now emerged that the evidence supporting these claims was forged. Is this the latest sign of the woke rewriting of history? A US and American airline has caused a stir after an online influencer praised its policy of allocating free seats for fat passengers. Is this just a fair and necessary principle of inclusivity, or are we just succumbing to those who make bad life choices? And today, Parliament debated a petition concerned with amendments to the international health regulations proposed by the World Health Organization. Is this another example of international bodies imposing legislation with no democratic consent? State of the Nation starts now. I'll be joined by a particularly Moggalicious panel this evening. With me will be the author and broadcaster Amy Nicole-Turner, along with the former MEP and one of my current sisters, Annunziata Rees-Mogg. As always, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's time for the news of the day with Sophia Wensler.
Good evening. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. Russell Brand has been questioned by police for a second time over alleged sexual offences. The actor and comedian was interviewed under caution last week over 6 allegations after being questioned last month over 3 other claims. The 48-year-old has been accused of rape, assault and emotional abuse between 2006 and 2013, following a joint investigation by the Sunday Times, The Times and Channel 4 dispatches. He strongly denies the claims. A body that was found in the River Wensum in Norwich has been formally identified as Gaynor Lord. The mother of 3 disappeared after leaving work in the city centre on the 8th of December. Police say the cause of death appears to be consistent with drowning, and there were no indications of any third-party involvement. A Stop the Hate protest over the government's immigration policies has taken place outside the Home Office in London. Refugee rights campaigners gathered at the march organised by Stand Up to Racism to mark International Migrants' Day. Justice Project founder Jeremy Corbyn spoke at the rally, blaming Britain's involvement in the bombing and the wars in the countries from which the refugees are fleeing. Baroness Michelle Mone has hit out at the Prime Minister after he said he takes the scandal surrounding her involvement with a PPE firm incredibly seriously. It's after she admitted she's set to benefit from a contract between PPE firm MedPro and the government, which generated a £60 million profit. Posting on social media, Lady Mone said, "I was honest with the Cabinet Office and the NHS in my dealings with them." Yesterday, she told the BBC she contacted Michael Gove at the start of the pandemic after he made a call to arms for massive quantities of personal protective equipment. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer described the scandal as a shocking disgrace from top to bottom. Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak says the government has launched a legal case against the company.
This whole situation is subject to an ongoing criminal investigation, but also the government is taking action, legal action against the company involved. So there's a limit to what I can say, other than to say we take all these things incredibly seriously, and that's why the government's taking legal action, and because there's a criminal investigation ongoing, I can't comment any further.
2 men have been arrested by counter-terror police after a ULEZ camera was damaged in a blast. The Met Police says a low-sophistication improvised explosive device was used in south-east London on the 6th of December. No one was injured when the IED was detonated in Sidcup, but vehicles and residential property were damaged. Police say a 60-year-old man from the area is being questioned, along with a 61-year-old who was arrested in Horsham in West Sussex. This is GB News across the UK, on TV, in your car, on your digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back to Jacob.
Our new Minister for Common Sense, former GBNews star Esther McVey, came out with fighting talk today with a piece in the Daily Mail setting out her priorities for setting the country back on a path of prudence and pragmatism. Esther declares a war on woke, particularly on public sector waste and absurdly foolish employment practices. Taxpayer value for money is essential, and with so much taxpayer cash, that's your cash, ladies and gentlemen, being wasted on vacuous and self-righteous roles such as diversity officers, we need something to be done to stop this happening. Interestingly, according to a Freedom of Information request from the Taxpayers Alliance, last year the NHS, the National Health Service in England, turned out to employ 800 diversity and inclusion officers, costing a total of £40 million per annum. Many of these people are paid more than nurses, who I think most of you would think are a bit more useful. Ms McVey also slams bizarre employment practices within the public sector which waste your cash, a particularly egregious scandal during a period of record inflation and a cost of living crisis. One example that may irritate as much as amuse you is that some local councils who have found their staff don't go into work are paying the self-same staff their heating bills so they can carry on not working from home. This is a terrible, wasteful use of taxpayers' money, and this type of inefficiency deserves to be curbed. Public sector workers are public servants, and they need to be allowed to get on with their jobs, not spend all their time and energy in moralistic progressivism, which can, as we discovered with Aviva last week. Do you remember that? Aviva don't like white men, so you can only get a job with them if the Grand Fromage, whose name I think is blank, thinks you should be allowed. So it ends up that diversity becomes discrimination in not just the public sector, but can in the private sector too. So the Minister for Common Sense was brought in to make sure that employees can spend their time doing the jobs for which they're paid, not worrying about whose tender sensitivities they may offend, nor complying with ever-emerging newspeak, nor filling a gender or race diversity quota. And this is a great aim for Esther. I wish her success. I want her to succeed. It is fundamentally important. It will lead to a better, more efficient state. But there is a difficulty. And the difficulty is the Equality Act, which creates the public sector equality duty, which has put wokery into legislative form. Before she can really win her battle, this bill will need to be repealed. And that way, taxpayer value can be restored. As usual, as ever, I want to hear from you, mailmog@gbnews.com, but I'm now joined by the Director of Data and Impact at the Free Speech Union, not the author of Silence of the Lambs, but nonetheless a very distinguished Thomas Harris. Thomas, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Jacob.
Everyone wishes Esther well, but is the legislative framework there for her to be able to do it?
Well, you're right that the Equality Act, since it came in 2010, has created this sort of privileged class according to gender identity, sexuality, race, and we've seen that at the Free Speech Union. We've had over 2,250 cases. And interestingly, since we were formed in February 2020, but interestingly, we win over 70% of those cases. So what that says to me is that companies are not actually applying the law appropriately. A good example would be the For Starter finding, which said that gender-critical views, so believing a man can't become a woman or that a woman can't become a man, they have now been proved to be protected under the Equality Act. But what we found is that although that is now established, companies, public sector organisations, Whitehall, aren't yet recognising that and putting that into practice.
And they spend a lot of time and money, particularly in the public sector, with diversity officers, trying to enforce particular views on people who work for them and criticising them if they don't go along with this.
That's right. I mean, Esther McVey today said she wanted to eliminate groupthink. Well, what we found is that these equality, these diversity and inclusion policies, when they've been implemented, have done quite the reverse. Because it's the same old critical race theory in the case of racial issues, or it's gender ideology and extreme transgender ideology in the case of gender issues.
And the gender ideology does bash up against other protected characteristics. A few months ago, a young Muslim gentleman came up to me who is a civil servant and said to me that he found it very difficult to accept these gender views that he was almost required to hold in the department he works in, which I won't say because I don't want to identify him, but he works in a important government department, and he found this clashed with his religion. So you have one bit of equality bashing against another, and which wins in these circumstances?
That's exactly the right question. We're starting to see more and more of that as each side in the sort of battle for the protected characteristics fights it out. We are seeing these skirmishes start to arrive, and I don't think that that's fully been appreciated or understood. And yet we're still seeing them pushed so hard by the same old providers, especially external providers of diversity and inclusion, who are not regulated, by the way.
And once you create diversity and inclusion officers, they have a job to do, don't they? They have to go around and prove that things aren't working, otherwise why on earth have they got a job? So they have a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy to create problems rather than just letting people get on with their job.
Yes, if they were brilliant at their jobs and they sorted out all of these inequality issues or lack of inclusion and they got that sorted, there'd be a time limit on it. And in 2 years' time, they'd say, right, OK, we're going home now. We've done the job.
But in a different world, could you be a diversity and inclusion officer advocating for free speech? Is there a role that they could fulfil that would be useful?
I think there is a sense in which that could happen. I mean, a good example here is the higher education sector, where we now actually do have, in Professor Arif Ahmed, a director of free speech and academic freedom in the Office for Students. And that is going to be very interesting to see how this new protected issue of free speech works out in that forum. And we'll see if we can apply that, or something similar could be applied in Whitehall. Because
you obviously want people to be in a working environment where they're treated fairly and they're treated justly. And isn't that the underlying aim of the diversity inclusion officers, even if sometimes it goes wrong?
The theoretical ideas of inclusion and the theoretical ideas of diversity, very few people would debate with those and say that's wrong. It's just the practical outworking of this is so the opposite of groupthink. It's unidimensional.
So are you more optimistic than I am? Because I think Esther will succeed if she repeals the Equalities Act. But do I get the impression that you think it can succeed just by moral drive and the power of her personality to push this through Whitehall, that she can do it within the current law because the intention is benign?
I'm optimistic about the higher education world, given that we've got Professor Arif Ahmed and the Office for Students now. I'm less optimistic when it comes to other areas of the public sector, because those teeth that new role has are just not there. So this new code of conduct, or whatever it is that Esther McVey rolls out, could just be ignored. So in that way, I agree that really is to be tested, and I might be a little bit more pessimistic about that.
All right. Well, nonetheless, we wish Esther well, and thank you very much, Thomas. Coming up, trans guidance in schools reaches a compromise with concerns about the legality of an outright ban. Are we about to see yet more flannel from ministers on this divisive issue? Plus, our Lord Nelson has been criticised by some historians, not very good ones actually, for being racist. But is Britain's most iconic naval hero, with suitable apologies to Drake and Bembo, the victim of misinformation? Now, academics seem to think the evidence of his racism was in fact a forgery.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel. Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Flight. Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is still State of the Nation. We've been discussing wokeness, employment law, and our new Minister for Common Sense, and you've been sending in your trenchant views. Mo says, "Hi, Jacob. When was the last time British law was repealed? Don't hold your breath on the woke bill being repealed." Well, the 1972 European Communities Act was repealed by the grace of God. And Tony, the Equality Act is ludicrous. It needs to be repealed. I'm so pleased you're speaking about this. Well, thank you very much, Tony. Long-awaited government guidance on trans matters in schools will be announced by ministers tomorrow, following internal disputes about how to approach the issue. The Attorney-General, Victoria Prentice, warned ministers that a blanket ban on so-called social transitioning within schools by rules on names, pronouns, uniforms and so on could potentially be a violation of the Equality Act, that act again. It seems officials have vacillated on the outcome and are reportedly planning to declare that schools must proceed with caution and strictly limit the circumstances in which pupils can change gender, in order to avoid staff being able to pressurise children into transitioning, as well as declaring schools have no obligation to support pupils altering their gender. Well, with me now is my panel, the author and broadcaster, Amy Nicole Turner, along with the former MEP and one of my current sisters, Annunciata Rees-Mogg. Amy, do you think this guidance will make any difference? What does it actually mean as far as you can establish?
I'm really upset by this guidance. I think that this guidance has just reversed the whole issue. It's just rowing back on something that we know isn't effective. And it frustrates me to see politicians doing the job of medical bodies and psychiatric specialists who have said for a long time now that gender-affirming care and allowing social transitioning is so important to treating trans children. One doctor, Dr. Helen Webberley, she's written an open letter to Kemi Badenoch just warning about the consequences of not letting a child be who they are early on. She's likened it to cancer treatment. It's important that we get there early. The most important thing for a child is self-esteem. And crucial to underpinning all self-esteem is to let them know that it's okay to be who they are. And I think if you frustrate that...
It's just not like cancer. It's completely different.
But then why do all the experts in the area that worked in this field
they've all changed their mind. I mean, 20 years ago they
years,
said it was a mental illness and they then changed their minds.
The people working currently, the people I trust...
Do not all. The people you trust may well, but there are actually an awful lot of experts questioning whether it is appropriate to always be affirming and not asking children who are, after all, still learning, still open-minded, are not formed adults, are not capable of adult decisions, but not even asking them to question why they were doing something, why they want that, what are their motivations. Just affirming doesn't let them even think about why they might want to be making life-changing decisions that have permanent effects on the rest of their futures.
I think most people who end up transitioning, they say that they knew around the age of 4 who they were and what they wanted from their future. And to frustrate that and to not acknowledge that or see it for what it is incredibly dangerous. And that's why
the Tavistock Centre has been proved to be incredibly dangerous in and of itself, and it was all about affirmation.
Absolutely incorrect why the Tavistock closed down.
If you just push children, often with other issues, a lot of autistic children are going down this route as a proportion. If you push them down a route, it's very dangerous for them, and you have seen quite a lot of detransitioners who realised that they took a route because it was put to them that it was what they should do, but not because it's what they needed to do or wanted to do.
Still only make up 1% of all the people that go through transition, which is still incredibly small. However, I would agree with you that we need to obviously approach everything on a case-by-case basis, and everybody deserves to get heard as an individual rather than all tarred with exactly the same brush. And I agree that there could be other things that need to be addressed and looked at. But if you deny social transitioning, then that is setting a dangerous precedent.
I think this legislation or guidance is heading in the right direction. But the fact that they can't change it, that the government can't make it as strong as they want because of the Equalities Act, I think shows a real problem. And back to the conversation you were just having, that it needs to be changed.
Amy, isn't there an issue, though, that children need protecting? That I'm all in favour of freedom and of liberty and of people making choices for themselves, but the one area where that doesn't apply is for children. And children who could potentially making decisions that will affect their whole lives could ultimately affect whether they have children or not. No. Surely you need to have some both societal and parental regulation of that, and they should be making the decisions rather than saying, look, this is all fine, because children go through phases.
Of course we need to protect children, but this is exactly why we need to allow the children the space to explore who they are, which in some cases is still a vanishingly small amount of children, but it's been proven that social transition and gender-affirming care very, very early on, which it's important to note, does not involve any medical intervention. I mean, there's the argument about puberty blockers, but let's put that to one side. We're talking about letting a child explore their gender identity, which, as we've discussed so many times, is an immutable part of yourself.
Isn't that likely to make a child deeply unhappy?
No, what will make a child deeply unhappy is not acknowledging them and not accepting who they are. And that is tried and tested.
Well, I've allowed you the last word against my sister, which is brave of me. Anyway, over recent years, one of our greatest naval heroes, Lord Nelson, has been accused of being a racist supporter of slavery. An article from The Guardian, a newspaper that used to be available only in Manchester, in 2017 by Afua Hirsch called for Nelson's column to be toppled. It would be quite a toppling, and went on to brand Lord Nelson a white supremacist after letters emerged which appeared to suggest he was in favour of the slave trade. However, it now appears that those letters were forged. Historian and chairman of the Nelson Society, Chris Brett, has said that those who were opposed to the abolition of the slave trade edited a genuine letter of Nelson's to make it seem as if our hero from the Battle of Trafalgar would have supported their cause. Well, let's listen to what the author of the Guardian article, Afua Hirsch, had to say when she accused Nelson of being a white supremacist.
What do ISIS, Norway and jungles have in common? They are all places I should allegedly F off back to, having dared to question the status of our great national hero, Admiral Nelson. It all started when I noticed my fellow Brits criticising America's Confederate statues, comfortably suggesting that they should be pulled down. Having researched some of our own historical figures, I know for a fact that we too are still commemorating the men, and they almost always are men, who played a huge role in enslaving millions of Africans, starving millions of Indians, or looting and pillaging vast swathes of the empire for their own personal enrichment.
Joining me now in the studio is the man who discovered some of this forgery, historian and author of Nelson and the Slave Trade, Chris Brett. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming in. How did you discover it was a forgery?
Going back to the Afua Hirsch article, that sort of triggered thoughts that something was not right, because for 200 years books have been written about Nelson, and never has he been accused of being pro-slavery. So our researchers were investigating versions of a letter that Nelson had written in June 1805. And in about 2020, we discovered one version of that letter that clearly wasn't in Nelson's handwriting. So we were suspicious. The trouble was we couldn't find the original of that letter. Some investigation led us to find out that it was in the British Library, but we couldn't access it because of COVID. I had taken a screenshot of a letter that was in an auction catalogue several years before, and when I looked at the first forgery that we found, I thought, actually, there's some similarities here. And when we compared them, we realised that we were looking at versions of Nelson's original letter, but we didn't know what the changes were until we could access the letter in the British Library.
So this is a period, obviously, before photocopying, and therefore, if a copy of letter is made, it could easily be written by somebody else. Yeah. Nelson had lost his arm, was writing with his wrong hand, certainly later in his life, and therefore I don't think he was very keen on writing if he could avoid it. So he could have had an amanuensis write for him. So it wasn't just a letter written for Nelson by someone else which he signed. You're sure of that?
Absolutely sure, because the very first forged letter has a little footnote to it which refers to someone being killed at Trafalgar. The reference refers to Alexander Scott. This gets quite complicated here. Alexander Scott was Nelson's chaplain, but he wasn't killed at Trafalgar. It was Nelson's secretary, John Scott, who was killed at Trafalgar. So that allowed us to start to date that letter from after Trafalgar, because it referenced the battle.
So after Nelson's death?
After Nelson's death. After Nelson's death. But before the news, the detailed news of the battle had reached Jamaica. So between perhaps October, November and January, November 1805 and January 1806, the letter was copied. But we couldn't find the original letter to compare it with to see whether there'd been any changes. Subsequent researchers allowed us to track down a true copy of Nelson's original letter. He produced something called pressed letters, a very early form of photocopying used by the Navy. And Nelson kept his private letters in a collection. They weren't for public record. They weren't submitted to the Admiralty. They were in a collection of letters which are now known as the Bridport letters. And we were able to find the photocopy of Nelson's original letter. From then, at that point, we could then compare the two forgeries against it.
And this is all the time Nelson dies. It's just around Trafalgar. Nelson is the most extraordinary hero at this point. The only similar public outpouring of emotion for a death is Diana, Princess of Wales, that the country is wandering around the streets weeping when Nelson dies. So to use his name for a political campaign would have been stunningly powerful.
Oh, absolutely, and I think it was the opportunity that the West Indian planters decided to take. Nelson, of course, wasn't going to be around to question them. And they made some very subtle changes to the letter, but they were very important. They upped the ante in the letters by emphasising the importance of the empire. And so the politicians of the day were going to see the loss of the slave trade as a threat to the empire. That's exactly what the slavers wanted them to understand. They weren't words used by Nelson.
And the truth is that if Nelson had not won the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, defeated the French and Spanish navies, the Royal Navy wouldn't have ruled the waves and the British Empire would not have been able to stop the slave trade. So he is actually the hero of stopping slavery.
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt that once the slave trade was abolished, that the Royal Navy were active in suppressing the trade on the high seas. And they pursued that with the same vigour that they protected the interests of the empire before the abolition of slavery. So certainly it created some of the conditions for the abolition, no doubt at all.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Coming up, an online argument raises over an airline's policy of assigning a free extra seat to fat passengers. Has the world gone potty? Plus, is the World Health Organization meddling once again in our own public health policy?
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We were discussing the government's gender policy in schools, as well as Lord Nelson's letters, and you've got strong issues on the gender issue, less on Nelson's letters. David says, if you can't smoke, can't drink or drive until you're 17, can't get tattoos until 18, how can they possibly let children make life-changing decisions? And Alison says, they can always be who they want to be. Their body doesn't need to be doctored. Your body doesn't stop you being who you want to be. Love thyself and the skin you are in. US. United States low-cost airline Southwest has caused a stir after its policy of allowing an extra seat for overweight passengers, which sparked an online debate. Self-described super-fat TikToker J. Lynn Cheney lauded the long-standing policy to her 140,000 followers, triggering the debates. Many social media users took to their platform to join Ms. Cheney in applauding the company's policy for accommodating treatment of overweight and obese customers, citing both physical and financial accessibility. Is this a capitulation to those choosing to live unhealthy lifestyles, or with more than 2 in 5 Americans classed as obese? Is it just an economic necessity? Well, last time our panellist Amy Nicole-Turner locked horns over the issue, so we thought we'd have round 2. So we're delighted to be joined by Steve Miller and our star, Amy Nicole-Turner. Come on, Steve. I'll let you go first, though ordinarily one should let ladies go first, but you're down the line, which is, I suppose, a disadvantage. This is faintly ridiculous, isn't it, that if people need 2 seats, they should pay for 2 seats. People who are tall don't get given extra legroom, an issue I feel strongly about.
Yeah, I think it's bonkers. And what's really interesting is this week, when I was talking to all of the wonderful fat people that I support, they were all saying it's the most patronising initiative that they've ever come across. They do not want a fat freebie. What they want is support. They want direct support. And also what they're embarrassed about is that other passengers will probably have to subsidise their fat freebie. It takes away the R word, the responsibility word. And actually, what we need to be doing is encouraging people to shrink their rotund rears, so to speak, which can be done. And by saying to people, no, you can have a fat seat either side, because actually, as I understand it, you can have two free seats if you're too fat, is going to do absolutely nothing. Yes, it's about encouraging people. Encouraging people sometimes is about actually telling them to wake up and actually start eating more fresh air and sorting it out. Ludicrous.
Okay, so Steve was saying they should get off their rotund rears, get more fresh air, get out, get more exercise, and then they'll all be fine.
So I think the problem with Steve's approach is that he always puts it down to 100% a case for the individual. He loves individual blame and personal responsibility, which ends up just stigmatising whoever he's working with, when actually obesity is far more complex than that and is environmental factors, socioeconomic factors, and let's not forget the big one, 75% genetic factors. And I think if Steve could appreciate that and approach his work with a little more holisticness and maybe a little bit of empathy and compassion, then he might be a bit more successful.
So, Steve, you have the advantage over Amy that you can actually hear her and she can't hear you. So she's done that brilliantly on lip reading. So continue with your clear enunciation so she can carry on lip reading for your return.
Well, I mean, I like Amy a lot, but she often has a hissy fit. And the thing, let's remember, I'm the one that's working directly with people every single day of the week. And actually, when it comes to genetics, that's been poo-pooed many times, you know. In fact, I've got a quote here. A professor from the University of London Genetics Institutes explained that research of genetics aligned to obesity has been quite exaggerated. It's absolutely baloney. No one is fat in the family. There is always something you can do about it. And what I would say to Amy is that what she needs to do is give people the aspiration and the hope and the motivation that they can lose weight, rather than giving them a large helping of excuses to actually stay fat.
So Steve's saying it's not genetics, they just need to have no excuses to stay fat and should pull themselves together.
Well, I expected him to say something very much along those lines, because as I said, he just puts it down to the individual. And I think, did I hear you correctly that you said I was having a hissy fit? See, it's all about me, and I'm having a hissy fit. If we look at this properly, it is genetics, Steve. It's 75% genetics. And I trust leading endocrinologists, science and medical bodies who all have come to this conclusion quite comfortably, while you continue to peddle that this is a massive moral panic, that we all should be extremely concerned about.
Goes on and on about this. On and on about this all the time. I'm the one that works with these people. I'm the one that works with these people.
Because Amy can't hear you. So
I'm not going to have that.
Steve, Amy can't hear you, so I'm going to cut you off there. But thank you very much for joining me. I'm sorry we didn't get the battle royal that we'd hoped for, but sound problems in our new studio were problematic. But I'm going to bring Annunziata in. Come on, Annunziata. Whose side are you on?
I'm afraid I'm not on the side of giving free seats to larger people, because the cost has to be borne. And that surely isn't fair, because whoever's faulted it is certainly not the people who don't need two seats. There are a huge number of health-related problems that are caused directly or indirectly by obesity and even just being overweight. All causes of death: high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, stroke, gallbladder disease, mental illnesses such as depression. I think giving extra succor to that is not helpful for the people, and it's certainly not helpful for the people who haven't done...
Isn't it helpful for the people sitting next to them who don't get squashed? But
they'll be paying for two tickets themselves, effectively.
But I guess
a ticket and a half, because prices will rocket, particularly as 40% of the Americans are in this category. Potentially, they haven't given, as far as I know, exact size details to be more accurate. But prices will inevitably go up. And if you're doing state-to-state, short-haul flights, you might well put up with a bit of discomfort for a ticket half the price.
I guess my issue with this whole thing is it's the last form of socially acceptable discrimination, isn't it, calling somebody fat? And the thing is that with the plane journeys scenario, surely everyone is entitled to fly in comfort. And
No, you're not. You're only entitled to fly in comfort if you pay for it.
But you
aeroplanes are stunningly uncomfortable, and American Airlines deliberately make themselves uncomfortable. They are terrible.
My husband's 6'5" and gets no allowance for this at all, and his knees don't even fit. There isn't extra space for fun. You can pay to be on an exit aisle, but you don't get it for free.
Or you can pay to go first class. So you can pay for comfort on aeroplanes, but you can't on Southwestern. I think how much you pay, you'll be comfortable.
But the thing is, what if that's not within your means and you can't...
But so you can only be comfortable if you're fat. That just seems ridiculously unfair.
It's something that's completely not
If you're thin and tall, you have to be uncomfortable. But if you're fat, you get an extra seat. Is that reasonable?
I'd also argue that you should have extra leg room because you're very, very tall. I think we should all expect a modicum of comfort when we pay to fly. And there shouldn't be a penalty.
But then the ticket prices, and instead of saying go shooting
You
up.
have to pay for it. And I do not see why people who do not need 2 seats themselves should have to pay for people who do. And all of our costs would go up. And there might be environmentalists who argue this is a jolly good thing. Stop the poor from flying. I'm not one of those. I think we should be egalitarian about this. We should make it as cost-effective as possible. There are a lot of people who will take a little discomfort in order to be able to travel the world, and they should be allowed to, and they should be allowed to afford it.
Well, there we go. Well, next we'll get on to the green issues and the anti-flying fanatics there. But thank you very much to Steve and Amy and my current sister, Annunziata. Coming up, the World Health Organization has proposed amendments to international health regulations that would be legally binding on member states. But will Parliament have the chance to reject any amendments if they choose?
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Can you be quiet? What is this?
It's
my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We've been discussing airlines providing complimentary seats for fat passengers, and you've got some strong views on this. Howard says, this airline should never charge for excess baggage for thin travellers out of fairness. That's brilliant. If the weight is on you, you have to pay excess baggage for your bags, and if it's not, you get it free. That's a great idea. Alan says, surely they will be flown on jumbo jets, maybe 20 to a plane, and then they can split the cost between them. And David says, go back 80 to 100 years to the pre-post-war years. No one weighed 400 pounds. We ate and exercised, worked hard and didn't slouch. Very important not to slouch. Today, a petition was debated in Parliament on the proposed amendments to the 2005 International Health Regulations, an instrument of international law that is legally binding in international law on members of the World Health Organization, but not necessarily in domestic law. The petition, which has amassed over 116,000 signatures, calls for Parliament to give the opportunity to vote on whether to reject the amendments that have already been adopted and also the 307 proposed amendments that are currently being negotiated by the UK delegates to the 76th World Health Assembly. The amendments are largely concerned with pandemic preparedness, and those supporting the petition warn that this is another example of the WHO's paternalistic attitude to imposing international legislation regarding public health on member states. I'm very pleased now to be joined by the co-author of The Accountability Deficit and co-founder of Us for Them, Molly Kingsley. Molly, thank you for coming in. What is the World Health Organization trying to do?
Yeah, so this has been rumbling on for a bit, and, you know, it's attracted, I think, quite a lot of public consternation, although perhaps less so to date from parliamentarians and the media generally. And what they're trying to do is they are, under two different agreements, attempting to give themselves really, on the face of it, quite surprising powers. So at the moment, the World Health Organization identifies pandemics and it makes recommendations as to how to deal with those pandemics. We can argue about whether it does that well. I think a few of us are very dubious about that based on its performance during COVID. But under these two agreements, that would, as currently drafted, change, and they are proposing to give themselves effectively binding power to not only identify but to coordinate the global health response. As part of that power, they're also giving themselves power to censor material they don't like, effectively, the material they judge as public health disinformation.
That's really quite worrying because some of the information they wanted to censor during the previous pandemic turned out to be true.
Well, exactly, and some of the information that they put out turned out to be false. So, you know, they were very adamant that the origin of COVID couldn't have been a lab leak, and we know now that that was the most likely cause. Again, they were very adamant about, you know, asymptomatic transmission and about, you know, this very interventionist approach.
Yes, and with the lab leak, it's now thought at least to be a reasonable possibility that it came from Wuhan. But the WHO seems to be very sympathetic to China as a general rule. It didn't want to criticise China at all during the pandemic.
No, I mean, it's sympathetic to China, and of course you have to ask where the funding for the WHO comes from. And I think this is one of the things about this organisation. It has a very opaque funding structure. So although the organisation was originally born out of the UN, it's been a long, you know, it's moved away from the funding structure where it is funded by nation states, and 80% now of its funding comes from private interests.
OK, but the UK government funds it, or the British taxpayer funds it to a large extent. We're one of the most generous funders, and we don't have an axe to grind for China, particularly.
Yeah, that is all, you know, that is true. And what our government is saying about these negotiations is, you know, don't worry, everyone, it's a consensual process. We will have a right to veto. And, you know, there is an element of truth to that. I'm sure we'll get onto this. There are some very worrying things about where the process is, though, and whether we will actually have a right to veto provisions we don't like.
OK, we have a dualist system, which is fundamental. So it's why I said in the introduction that it will be binding in international law. But international law is not binding in domestic law until Parliament says so. International law, royal prerogative, domestic law legislation through Parliament, and Parliament trumps the prerogative as a basic constitutional point. So are we worrying unnecessarily?
So you're right in theory. I think what we saw during the pandemic was that actually the idea that Parliament would be vetoing, potentially emergency legislation, potentially legislation issued at huge speed, is naive, I think. Parliament didn't manage to veto the Public Health Act, which imposes very draconian powers. I think the other problem we're going to have with the WHO, and given where things are at, is it is very unlikely there will be a significant majority of parliamentarians who are alive to this issue. So even if the provisions get put in front of Parliament, I don't think from where we are today it is realistic to think there will be a sufficient body of MPs who understand what these provisions could entail.
Yes, although I've had quite a lot of correspondence from constituents about this. So constituents have been very diligent and there's been this petition. On the issue of emergency legislation, you're absolutely right. The first set of emergency legislation went through very quickly, but it required 6 monthly updates. The government initially proposed 2 years and that was brought down. And as you went through the process, MPs became more and more concerned and the government had less ability to push through draconian proposals. So we never required vaccine IDs for nightclubs and things like that because Parliament wasn't at all keen on it.
Well, we came very close to it. I mean, we did impose mandatory vaccination for care home workers almost without an impact assessment. And I think it's very difficult to argue that incredibly damaging measures weren't pushed through by government.
I agree with that, but I'm just saying that Parliament got alert to this. It took a bit of time, but if we were to have another lockdown, Parliament's been through this, as has the country, and therefore the focus would be much higher on the powers being used.
So I entirely agree with that. I mean, of course, you're making quite a big assumption here that there is a Conservative government in place, and I think the Labour minister who stood up today was, frankly, quite terrifying, Jacob. All for greater international cooperation, very strong powers, binding powers for the WHO. So were there a significant Labour majority, which by the time we're talking about is a possibility, I think you are in a very different world.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Molly. This is called State of the Nation because we believe in the nation state and the Westphalian settlement rather than international order. Anyway, finally, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, today voiced his support for British Hong Kong media tycoon Jimmy Lai, who you will have seen on this programme, his son, earlier in this year, and his national security trial over his Apple Daily publication, which dared to criticise the so-called, expecting to be omniscient and omnipotent Chinese Communist Party. Earlier today, the Foreign Minister, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, took an urgent question from Sir Ian Duncan-Smith in the House of Commons on this matter, and this is what she had to say.
You asked the Foreign Secretary what steps he will take to support Jimmy Lai during his trial and whether he will call for his immediate and unconditional release.
The Foreign Secretary has called on the Hong Kong authorities to end their prosecution of Jimmy Lai and release him. Mr Lai's prosecution is politically motivated. He has faced multiple charges to discredit and silence him. As an outspoken journalist and publisher, he has been targeted in a clear attempt to stop the peaceful exercise of his rights to freedom of expression and association.
Well, Lord Cameron's absolutely right in his call for the Chinese-controlled Hong Kong authorities to end their persecution and release Jimmy Lai. Mr Lai is being persecuted for the simple crime of wanting democracy for his homeland and refusing to apologise for it. Everyone who believes in liberty should be on his side. Lord Cameron's intervention follows a meeting with Mr Lai's son, Sebastian, who has previously slammed the UK for being incredibly weak on the issue. I would like to take this opportunity to echo Lord Cameron's comments and urge the government to do all it can to ensure Mr Lai is released from such indefensible captivity. His vindication would not just be personal to him, but for every citizen of Hong Kong who wants a free and fair democracy, and it would uphold the joint declaration between the UK and the Communist Chinese. We should support them and back them in this. Well, that's it from me. Next, it's Patrick Christie's. What's on your bill of fare this evening?
Well, we've uncovered some quite disturbing stuff about the indoctrination of children from nursery school through primary school, about some quite hard left radical ideology. So we'll be uncovering that right at the start of the show. I'm also going to be asking whether or not it's far right to want tougher border controls. Lee Anderson clears up that viral LBC clip about him definitely not headbutting his own son. Is the migrant crisis an act of war? We talk about that. And is it right to give money to the homeless in the run-up to Christmas? We're having a big debate on that. Sean Ward, the ex-Corrie star, joins us.
Well, that sounds as brilliant as always. I'm actually in the new studio for the first time, which has been exciting and I think has mainly gone well, other than very minor difficulties with audio. But it's been good to be here. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. The weather in Somerset is getting ready for Christmas. It'll be absolutely lovely. And if you look in the sky, you'll see Father Christmas coming soon.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hi there, it's Aidan McGibbon here from the Met Office with the GB News forecast. It is going to turn increasingly wet in the south overnight. Clearer skies developing further north, albeit with blustery showers. And we've got colder air coming in as well from the northwest. But before that happens, a number of weather fronts will linger across the southern half of the UK, bringing extensive cloud and increasingly persistent rain.